Hey guys, it's Leila from Ignite, and we're here today to have a bit of a chat about common mistakes that students have been making in their HSC trials and to give you our advice on how to best prep for the HSC. Johnny's over here saying hi.
What's up, guys? Welcome back. We know you liked that craft of writing video, so we thought we'd do another one.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, we've had a chat to some of our students who have gotten their HSC trials back, and what we've noticed is the most common mistake that students are making is that they're either ignoring the question altogether in their responses, or they've listened to our thesis statement videos and written a great thesis. However, I've lost sight to the question as their response has continued. So if you're at this stage now where you've got a really great exemplar response that you're happy with in all of your practices for your modules, but you're not too sure how you're going to adapt that to whatever question you get in the HSC, stay tuned and we've got some tips for you. Now, most of our tips are centered on this idea about how you frame memorizing your exemplars for the HSC. And a lot of students have this mindset that they need to memorize their essays kind of verbatim, word for word. I don't know if you found that as well, Johnny, with some of your students.
Yeah, and I encourage it. I think we have a different position on it, but we fundamentally coming from the same intention.
Yeah, exactly. Same intention. I think you do need to memorize your response, but not with the mindset of regurgitating exactly what's in your exemplar in the exam. And the reason for that is because if you are in that frame of mind and you get a question which is not particularly suited to your response, you're going to be really stuck in terms of how to actually engage with the wording in the question in the exam. We've had a chat to HSC markers, and we do know that as the marker picks up a paper, they look at the thesis statement and the topic sentences, and that in itself is an indicator for what kind of band the student is sitting in. So as a starting point, number one, be willing to really closely engage with the question, at least in your thesis and topic sentences, but have a listen to what we have to say about how you approach memorizing in general for the HSC. And I guess what I wanted to flag before Johnny goes into detail is there's a bit of a hierarchy in terms of what you memorize for the HSC and what will be most heavily adapted in the exam. So thinking a little bit backwards towards your drafting process for the HSC, you've got to pick evidence that's going to be applicable to any kind of question that you're going to get and have thematic values or focuses for your paragraphs, which will be willing to adapt to different questions. So number one, and Johnny, I think you agree, that the most important thing to memorize in detail is your evidence. That's not going to change in your exam. You're not going to whip out different quotes unless you have to engage with an extract in the question.
That's right, yeah. Quotes and techniques. And you want to pick, as I was saying, broad evidence, still ordered. You're still going to probably present those bits of evidence in the exact same order on the day as your draft, as the thing you've memorized. But there might be a slight exception on the technique thing, because sometimes questions can actually ask, for instance, there was one about Hamlet in the past, about imagery. And you might want to, if you can, actually manipulate the technique slightly sometimes. If you're talking about form, if you're talking about, how something is meta-theatrical, if you're talking about meta-theatre, right, for instance, you actually might want to boost that up to a topic sentence if a question had actually said explicitly, how does the composer use form to explore X and Y themes? Yeah. So you might want to play around there, but ultimately the quotes, the formal features, they're like the macro techniques and the more micro techniques, probably just not going to change.
Yeah, really important point, because even though you're going to prep your focus for the body paragraphs, the way you explain that focus will be driven by the question. For example, the question that Johnny mentioned on imagery in Hamlet, that was such a great question that students got stumped with, but they really shouldn't have, because when you think about it, imagery is used in any bit of evidence that you have. So if you had, for example, a quote that didn't explicitly in your eyes give rise to imagery, you could alter that and say, Shakespeare's use of imagery in this quote produces this kind of image of conflict in the play more broadly. So it's really about getting into this mindset where you've got the crux of what you want to say, but you're kind of using the question as a springboard to set the parameters of how you really address what you've already prepared for your essay. So yep, you're going to have your quotes and you're going to have your evidence there and the techniques, key aspects of form. However, you may elevate a certain technique or a certain aspect of form in your response contingent on the question. And just on that, that's why it's really important to be across all elements of forms and feature in the play or in whatever text it is as a whole. So you have that knowledge depending on what the question brings forward. So even if you haven't actually prepped imagery or, meta-theatre or fragmentation if it's Eliot or aspects of characterization if it's a novel, you need to know your text in its entirety and then whip out whatever you need to answer the question and be willing to be a bit candid in the exam.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that really important point there. You've got to interpret the key terms of the question broadly, as broadly as you need. Students will sometimes see a question and think, okay, all the evidence that I brought in is not going to work for this question. They're stumped. Like, how does this work? It asks about imagery, and I only mentioned imagery once in my whole essay. It's like, okay, as I was saying, you have to interpret it broadly to make it work.
Exactly.
And going even back to like step one, you should use evidence that is really powerful and broad enough that it falls within the general, like all of the themes that could roughly be applied to that text.
Yep.
So you want to use good evidence to start with, but on the day, if you've got your evidence, you need to interpret broadly. So a word like image, you need to be creative with how you even interpret that word.
Yep.
Don't think, oh, I directly think of this when I see that word, and I don't have anything that's to do with that. It's like maybe you're just not phrasing it the right way. Try and frame everything in a way that suits what you already have, and you're trying to manipulate things so you can get the words in. And look, one way I say, and not everyone will agree with this, is, you don't work for the question works for you, right? You go in with what you have, and you have to make the question work with it. You don't just come up with your evidence and go, okay, I'm going to work for that question. You just don't have time to take that approach.
Yeah.
So I always advocate for working out what way, creatively, and practice is the best way to do this. You've got to look at a number of questions after you've memorized a response to then practice this process of broadly applying different keywords and tricky questions and thinking creatively about how you can still hit that question, albeit in a way that actually fits nicely in with what you already had prepared.
Yeah, so just leading on from that, I think one of the most important things is that you're not memorizing your thesis statement. And linking to what Jonny just said there, when you get into the exam and you're looking at the keywords in the question and you're making the question work for you, to use Jonny's words, you're really defining those keywords with foresight in a way that suits what you're going to go on to say in your essay. And that's really important. When you do your thesis, don't actually develop an argument that you can't substantiate in your body paragraphs. For example, if you're looking at your human experience essay and you're focusing, let's just say for argument's sake, on 1984, and you've got body paragraphs based on, control, desire, or submission by the end of the text, and the question asks you about the paradoxes of human experience, you would frame each of those points in light of paradox, the paradox of being controlled, but also having simultaneous desire for agency. So do you see how you had that broad point that you've prepped, but the way that you would introduce that in the thesis and frame your idea is using the specific wording in the question to set the parameters of how you discuss it in your paragraph. So in that process of making the question work for you, you're looking at the question and defining those key words in a way that allows your essay to answer the question. And that's the key step to then not only having a thesis which links to the question, but actually also linking to the question throughout the entirety of your response.
Yeah, super important. Don't view that thesis part as distinct from the rest of the essay. So you're coming up with it on the day, but you're coming up with it from the perspective of, I already know what my first body is, my second body, my third body. I know where all that evidence is kind of about. It should all be grouped into separate ideas that progress, right? Those aren't going to change. You have to then answer and deconstruct that question in your thesis in a way that actually leads to those paragraphs making sense.
That's right.
It's such an important point.
Yeah, and it might mean like a slight reconceptualization of what that paragraph is actually targeting. Like control is also, a limitation on one's agency. It's also a limitation on autonomy. It's also the suppression of individualism, right? So you got to think, okay, the question, it might not be exactly what I want to say, but how can I use it to reframe my key ideas? And that's the real key in actually answering the question and getting into the band 6. And I think that's a nice segue maybe into our next slide.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go through how much of each part of a memorized draft essay you should be willing to change. How much will probably change on the day. I think this visual will give you a nice idea of it. So as we said, you need to be willing to go into, you can memorize a thesis to a different question just to have a rough structure there at least.
For your example.
But you should be, exactly, for the example. But when you go into that exam, you've got to be willing to potentially change all of it, right? All of it, but you can still have the structure of where the commas go and things like that. I find that makes you a little bit quicker on the day, but don't get too attached to those things, because in the thesis, what's heavy in red here, and really the whole introduction, needs to be heavily adapted. We want high adaptation in the introduction, and what does that mean? It doesn't mean what goes in each sentence changes. There's still a thesis that we would suggest goes in the first and potentially first and second sentence. And then the third sentence, you're going to introduce your text. You know the function of each sentence. That doesn't change no matter what question you get. What you're going to talk about in each question, or basically what you're meant to do with a sentence does not change, but what goes in it and answers that function is going to change on the day. So,
or the specific expression of that sentence.
Exactly. But the fact that, in a third sentence you've got memorized, okay, I say in Shakespeare's Hamlet or in George Orwell's 1984, that's not going to change. That doesn't have to change. It's just what you then say about it, what you say it explores, needs to have the words of the question in it. And you need to be coming at it from that frame. But it doesn't mean your third sentence now doesn't introduce the text. So, I hope that makes sense. You still have the function. Every sentence does the same thing. You're just what goes in it, which is being adapted.
Yeah, and I think on that, it's so important that the introduction has a link to the question in really every single sentence, perhaps minus the citation of your text. There's not really much you can do there. But even the way that you frame your context in Module B, if there's a particular word in the question, say it's an Eliot essay, it's asking about alienation, and you've got a point about industrialization or, the rapidly modernizing landscape. Tell me how that actually exacerbates the sense of alienation, right? So you've got to use that question to really guide you throughout all of your response. And it's particularly a danger when you actually get a question that you think works really well for your essay. You think implicitly, oh, this is exactly what I want to say. And then in those situations, students actually then forget to explicitly link to the question because they've gone into autopilot and thinking, okay, great, I can just regurgitate my memorized essay, but then they lose sight of the question. And that's especially fatal because you had an essay which could have potentially really directly engaged with the question. So be so conscious of it. I actually find, I don't know if you found the same thing, Jonny, when students thought that the question was really, really tough or it didn't work for their exemplar, they were then more conscious of creating links and they actually did better in those sections. Yeah. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, it can be, you can have the perfect essay set up and it can be a matter of just using the word instead of, the word of the question instead of a synonym that you happen to have already used. Maybe your essay is pretty much exactly what the question asked, except the keyword's slightly different.
That's right.
You need to use that keyword all the time. So when we say high adaptation, what that actually means is in each of these high read sentences, so introduction, especially thesis, topic sentence, link sentence, and conclusion, you should be having some part of some keyword from the question or even a derivative term. So, if the keyword's power, powerful is fine. You just need to have that word in there from the question in each of these sentences. No questions asked. It doesn't matter if it sounds over the top to you on the day. The markers will appreciate that what you're doing is having a focused essay, a focused response to the question asked. There's a reason they use that exact word. They want you to show you're using that word all the way through. Don't repeat the whole sentence of the question, but you should be using the exact key terms in a way that's expanding upon them in all of these high-read sentences. And you should be doing it within the body paragraphs when you explain the effect of a quote or technique. That you can see is in white. Probably won't change at all. As we said, quotes, techniques, you've got them, lock them in. Lock in how you express or how you introduce them rather. But in terms of when you say what the effect is, when you say, oh, this metaphor suggests ... that bit should be modified if possible. Not always. You don't need to have the word of the question in every single one. That will sound repetitive. Every single sentence of your whole essay has a key word in it. It doesn't have to work like that. But wherever it's possible to, and I'll just quickly segue into how I suggest actually doing this if you have a memorized draft. What you do in these situations is one of three things, basically. I'll give you my three ways of thinking about how to adapt what you already have to the question, right? If you have a really nice question that pretty much sits exactly, congruently with your draft, meaning you don't have to change much, but you might not use the exact word that they use, but use a synonym. For example, the question is about power, but you have control all the way through. Then it's just a matter of changing that word, literally in that case, if everything else really is the same. That's unlikely to be the case though, right? So you can use a synonym and a direct interchange, and that might be the bare minimum that you could do in some part. The next part is to not just consider the one word and feel restricted by all your other phrasing, but to actually rephrase the whole thing. So you're making a new kind of clause between one comma and another comma, rewording it so that you can get the word of the question in. So this is when it's not so easy to just substitute a word for another word in the question. This is when you actually have to think, how can I phrase this differently so that I focus this around that word, but you're still basically saying the same thing, right?
Like with my example of the paradox of human experience.
Exactly.
So question was paradox, but I know I want to talk about control. So I'm going to have to reframe control. Okay, what is paradoxical about control?
Yes.
Well, when you are being controlled, or at least in the case of Winston, it sparks his desire to have autonomy. And that's the paradoxical element. So that's when you're using the keyword. You're not just saying paradox of human experience, but you're using that word to almost describe the key theme that you're focalizing in that paragraph.
Exactly. That's a really good point. So when you're doing this rephrasing business, you're coming at it from the angle, it's like, here's what I've prepared. how can I reword that? How can I find a relationship between what I prepared and that keyword? Like, where does that keyword fit in? How do they relate together at all? Like, is that the how that happens, or is that the why that happens, or is that a negative of what I've already said? So you're finding a relationship between your topic sentence or your phrase that might be in the middle of a body paragraph. You're saying, how does this relate, if at all, to the keyword? And you're going to answer that question, and that will be the new phrasing, right?
Yeah, that's why it's so important, especially in a module like human experience, to go through all of those keywords in the rubric and pinpoint that word and ask yourself, okay, if I got anomaly of human experience, if I got shared human experience, if I got the telling or retelling of stories, how would I reframe what I've written in here to adapt to that? So really knowing your rubric well, going through all of those little key points there and asking, okay, if that question came up, how would I reframe this bit of evidence? And if you've already gone through all of those thought processes, the actual exam will not be stressful for you because you've already done that. So I think that's an important point to make as well.
Definitely. And I'll go through the third part of the adaptation is sometimes if you've got a very short and succinct sentence, which I advise, if you can say the technique in an effect, in one line of typed space, if you can do it in a very succinct way and it's not like a 60-word sentence, you might have the opportunity to do the old comma at the end suggesting this. And you might actually strategically do that where you plan to do a very short and succinct sentence that doesn't have any commas. You just say this does this, knowing you can chuck a comma on at the end and say, therefore illustrating, and then bring the word in and say, how does that relate to what I just said?
Yeah, so long as there's a causal link.
That's right. So long as there is that relationship, and if it's a short sentence, because you don't want to just get in the habit of just chucking on commas at the end. Your writing becomes very clunky and it's not sophisticated. So I'm caveating this with, if it's a short sentence, which you can strategically prepare in advance, that's also a great opportunity that students find is sometimes the easiest way to do it is just to add a clause, but only add a clause if you haven't already got too many clauses, meaning commas and things like that before it.
Yeah, so what I've actually advised some students to do is to go through their essay and actually highlight all of those parts that they know they're going to have to adapt to the question, or have that mindset that you're going to have to adapt. And that's really important because a lot of this is a bit of psychology. You want to be prepared before the exam knowing, okay, yep, you've got this connection to your essay. You drafted it with your tutor if that was the case. You want to be able to write that, but you can't be too attached to it. You have to remember, no, what's going to get me the marks is a question that a response that deals with the question. A marker will have more respect for you or give you more marks if it's a slightly imperfect essay, i.e., a little bit of clunky expression here or there because you are in an exam and you're writing under time conditions, but one that has a real fair go at answering that question, as opposed to this perfectly polished essay that they know was pre-prepared, but has a pretty tenuous connection to the question. So go for that former option, be tenacious in the exam, be willing to adapt, and I guarantee you'll get a better result.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's like a good point to finish on, is that to really nail the execution of what we're saying here is to sit down and do the practice, to highlight those clauses and to present yourself with a different question and then say, okay, how would I rewrite this body paragraph? How would I even I sit down with students and just say, here are your 3 existing topic sentences. Here's a question.
Yep, perfect.
Rewrite the 3 topic sentences with that, and we just practice the rephrasing, the substitution, and some work perfectly, as I said. It's just a matter of a one-word change. Others, we really try and nail that rephrasing, which is the true skill. And the more you practice, the more you'll sound sophisticated, even just with an on-the-day improvised expression.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, what Leila's saying is right. If you didn't do that, it is just better off sounding a little bit clunky.
Yeah.
You won't feel good about it because you had such a nice, polished sentence going in.
Yeah.
But you didn't mention the question. It has nothing to do with it. The marker's going to be ticking that word of the question, even if it's a little bit clunkier. You'll have more respect, probably more marks in the long run doing that strategy.
Exactly. And I think, I guess a point to end on is, so what now? So you got your trial marks back. This is the approach for memorizing. You've got your example. What do you do? So I think number one, before even now rememorizing your example, you might have a bit of editing to do pursuant to the feedback from your trial, from your marks, from the marker. And then if you haven't done this already, it's really crucial to time yourself writing that essay.
Oh, yeah.
So in order to do all of this in the exam, to unpack the question, to rewrite your topic sentences, to think about those links, you've got to have time. So I would say an essay 33 to 35 minutes is ideal for paper 2 because you've got 40 minutes, maybe around 38 minutes for paper 1.
Sure.
If, think about having to need...
you need more than 5 minutes. I mean, I went through this with all of my students. They come out of their exam and say, oh, didn't have time to write a conclusion.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's the students who I asked, did you time it? And they go, oh, I didn't time that essay. That was the one they didn't finish because they didn't have enough time to do it. It's all about preparation if you want to nail it and if you want to feel confident and calm about doing what we're saying. You're probably
Exactly.
thinking, oh, well, this rephrase in business, it's going to take so much time. It's like, well,
Exactly.
give yourself the time
Yeah.
and have a shorter essay going in.
That's right. And I just wanted to caveat, with paper one, you may need the extra time for comprehension. So
Absolutely.
even having it around 35 minutes might actually
Yeah.
be better for you. So time yourself writing your essays. Then, like Jonny mentioned, it's a matter of looking at as many different questions as you can. Now, I understand telling you to write 40-minute practice essays for as many essays is a little bit unrealistic. I get that you have other subjects to study for, but then at the very least, look at a question, do thesis statement and topic sentences.
Yeah.
So the reason that's so important is because by doing the topic sentence, you forced yourself to consider how the entire thematic basis for that paragraph would have to be shifted contingent on different question types. So do that, look at questions and time yourself. Realistically, you shouldn't take more than 3 or 4 minutes to write a thesis. That's all you've got in the exam. So put yourself under timed conditions, be used to writing under pressure, and you'll actually maybe train yourself to be a better writer under exam conditions, which is the most ideal state of being to do well in the HSC. So look over your essays, edits where needed, time yourself, and then force yourself to go through this adaptation process, look at as many different questions, and then reading over your response, highlight your links that you actually made to the question and ask yourself, okay, is this critical in terms of my engagement? Is it sophisticated? And is it a legitimate link that I've made to the question? I think that's it.
Finish.
Yeah, thanks guys.
Thank you for tuning in, guys. Make sure if you did enjoy this video, you like it, subscribe to our channel as we'll be bringing out lots more content. And if you are looking for resources to really hone in on these texts, go to ignitehsc.com.au and I'm sure you'll find some really handy resources on your texts. But it's been a pleasure, Les.
Thanks, James. And also comment if you've got any questions. We'll get back to you.
Absolutely. All right,
Thanks,
guys. Until next time.
See ya.